I'm very happy and very honored to welcome 4 distinguished guests on this panel who will have a lot to tell us about one of the key problems in the energy transition in general and the question of nuclear in particular, because as we will see, nuclear is very often seen as a very expensive thing to build that provides then very cheap electricity on the long run. And how we can rethink the way of investing in nuclear and what it means for the future is something I'm going to discuss in greater detail with the distinguished members of the panel. I start with Dr. Sunniva Rose, who's a nuclear physicist, who works, I think, communications for Nuclear Norway, if I'm mistaken, and is also a lecturer at Oslo University. Followed by Princess Mthombeni, the founder of Africa for Nuclear, James Krellenstein, or Krellenstein, which sounds a little bit like a Bond villain's name, so I think this goes very well, the founder of Alva Energy, and Jonas Kristiansen Nøland, associate professor at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. Now, Sunniva, if I might begin with you, because you're in communications. And do you think there is a problem with nuclear, particularly when it comes to the narrative and the way it is communicated? Because very often, if you enter debates about why we should invest more in nuclear, the argument is it's too expensive, it takes too long, it's not economical. So how would you counter such arguments?
Well, I've been part of, in Norway, the debate about nuclear for more than a decade now, and it started with the Fukushima nuclear accident. And I've seen that in Norway, that the arguments are changing. So 10 years ago it was, no, but it's dangerous, and it was, no, but it's waste. Now it's like, we don't need it in Norway, and it's too expensive. So every time you explain something and you sort of give good answers, you just change the arguments. And I believe that deep down there is a fear. I think that is a fear of radiation that is really deep down there. So for me, since I am a nuclear physicist, that is my background, even though I now work in a private company that wants to establish nuclear energy in Norway because we can see that it's a good thing to do and we can make money on it. So we're just sort of also saying that, well, yeah, it's expensive to build, but this is absolutely something that could be a good business case. But to the communication part, what I always do, I always start with telling people everything is made out of atoms. Every atom has a nucleus. Some of these nuclei can fission. This is fission. This is what happens. And I go down there. And in my experience, that is when people say, I sort of get it now. And I sort of, you can, I think you have to really go down to the basics before you can even talk about the economy of it, or at least that's my experience, because then people are not scared anymore because they understand, okay, so it's this and that and X, Y, Z. So that's very, very short about that. But so the short answer is probably yes, there is something about communicating this because it's technology. It's not as simple as hydropower for people maybe to understand, and then you can go into all different kinds of aspects.
All right, in light of this, let me be a little bit conspiratorial. Jonas, you have looked quite intensely in the calculations of the price, for example, of a megawatt hour, of a kilowatt hour of electricity. And you take issue with some of the dominant calculations that claim that nuclear is too expensive and the alternatives are cheaper. Maybe you can dive a little bit into this.
Yeah, it's this LCOE narrative, levelized cost of energy. To bring you a little bit back historically, 50 years ago it was a tool used to calculate the electricity price for firm dispatchable energy sources in a non-deregulated power market. And now this tool has been transformed into being used for non-firm, non-dispatchable power sources in a deregulated power market. So then you get the big confusion here. But I would say, like, for when it comes to LCOE, in the long term, I think nuclear energy can be very, very competitive. Like, if you look at nuclear energy on a 100-year time horizon, you consider the time till payback of the first investment. You consider the time when you operate a nuclear power plant that has been paid down, and you're also considering lifetime extensions over this 100-year period. The average electricity price needed to cover all costs in this 100-year time frame is just 33 euro per megawatt hour. So it means that actually, if you can climb over this this challenge of this front-heavy investment. This is an investment in future generations. It's the only way we can achieve intergenerational justice is to actually invest in nuclear energy. If we don't invest in nuclear energy, we will not get intergenerational justice because we will not be investing in the future generations today. This is a very, very important topic. Like, we can't only build bikes, we also need to build rail for the future, critical infrastructure.
All right, James, I can tell you're itching to say something. But let me hold you back a little bit longer, because I want to ask you, as one of the founders of Africa for Nuclear, there is very often the argument being made that the developing world and sub-Saharan Africa, that they should jump over one development step. The argument is, right, they should skip the fossil age, they should skip nuclear and should go right all renewables, they should go right all to solar, all to wind, all to hydro, which might be possible in some areas. What would you reply to this? What is your reason that you say that nuclear is actually a key in the development of Africa?
Thank you so much. Greetings to everyone. I like the point that you touched on us skipping everything and just go renewables, because I always say, what would happen if, as African nations, we look at what has developed the developed nations and implement those energy sources? Because for me, I'm more about abundance, energy, and let's look into issues of climate change after, because you cannot control the climate or the pollutions unless you give access to electricity to everyone. That's the only way that you can control it. And yes, it is correct that we are being persuaded to jump and just implement renewables, which I think it's unfair. So, and because I advocate for nuclear energy in Africa, because I believe in development, I believe in industrialization, and I believe in ending the energy poverty and achieve equality as African continent. And I realized that that will never happen unless we have dispatchable power. And we are going to get that dispatchable clean power from nuclear energy. And that's what I advocate for. And I just wish that all the nations that are here would understand that Africa needs abundance energy. It does not need only weather-dependent energy. Together, we can achieve a lot by an energy mix that involves all these energy technologies that we need going forward.
All right. James, you're metaphorically going nuclear, I can see.
Yeah,
so,
I don't mean to be going nuclear at all, but I think the topic of this panel here is about thinking about how we think about investment in nuclear energy. And I think you made a fantastic point about that the economics of nuclear power, especially over a 100-year time horizon, are very, very good. And for a lot of lower income countries or developing nations in Africa and around the world, nuclear power represents a really fundamentally empowering energy source. But the question we need to ask is, how are we going to mobilize the financial resources needed to do this in an effective way? And I think we should be kind of blunt and honest here about the history of nuclear energy and financing, right? And that we have seen many, many challenges on financeability of nuclear energy. In the United States, right, which has the largest current nuclear power generation capacity, right? We've seen multiple utilities who've ordered nuclear power plants go bankrupt in the process of ordering those nuclear power plants. In Europe, we watched, Framatome and Areva go bankrupt itself due to cost overruns associated with nuclear power plant builds. And I think our industry has responded to these financing challenges with a nuclear engineering solution in the small modular reactor market, right? And basically making smaller reactor designs that have lower upfront capital costs, but maybe actually higher generation costs over their sort of operating history. And I feel like we're now in this sort of weird middle space, let's be frank, where we have a lot of great nuclear technology, both on the small and large size. We have a lot of even sites and appetite in nations from higher income countries to lower income countries, but we are having at this point a very hard time financing those builds. In my country, we have over 14 gigawatts electrical of new nuclear fully approved by the regulator, and the lack of the ability to find out a way to finance that means that that's not getting built. And I think we need to collectively have that discussion. And even in lower income countries, I think the World Bank still maybe this is about to change, does not support nuclear projects. And let's think about together, I'm not obviously very pro-nuclear, I want to see nuclear power developed, but I think we need to be clear-eyed about the financing challenges that our industry faces right now.
Well, Sunniva, as a nuclear physicist, maybe you can go a little bit dive into this. What has changed in the past? I mean, I remember in the 1970s, it took us about 8 to 9 years to build a 1 gigawatt nuclear power plant. Now, if we look at Finland and other countries, or in Georgia, right, it takes 12, 13, 14, 15, up to 18 years. Has the technology changed? Is it like, you learn how to ride a bike and you know how to ride it on Monday and then you forget it on Tuesday and then you kind of relearn it on Wednesday? I mean, what has happened? Why did we get worse in building nuclear power plants compared to the past?
Well, I think we know. I think we know the answer. We are in a country that has just proved that it is possible to build nuclear power in a completely different way. It's not new technology. It's classic technology, but they've been smart. They had a design that was 100% finished. They did 4. They had a plan to do it. They saw that from building the first one to building the fourth one of the Baraka, that cost and time went down as it should do. But I guess also in Europe and also in the US, there's been a long pause now after after Chernobyl, really, in 86, where there has been, we haven't built anything in 20 years. And I think we can ask anyone who's making anything big, any mega project, when you do it for the first time, it will cost much more than for the second, third, and fourth, and it will take much more time. In Norway, we see this when we build an opera. It takes a lot of time. It's the same thing. When we build anything big and for the first time, it takes forever. And when we waited 20 years, we have lost a lot of that competence, and we can make that again. And of course, then you have the other things that after these accidents, and then you got a fear in the public, we were sort of like made a solution to that with making even more. We have to make it even safer, even safer, even safer. I'm not saying that nuclear power should not be safe. It should, and it is. But I think that sometimes we, and when I say we, maybe then I should mean actually we nuclear physicists, nuclear engineers, we don't want to take the time it takes to actually really talk to people and go down to the core and start with that. So we say, so you thought that this was scary, so I have another solution. Look at this, look at thorium, look at fourth generation reactors, instead of talking about what do we have and why is this actually safe.
So, James, you are an entrepreneur in the energy sector. I think that's
physicist as well,
that's fair to say. Now, if you would have to assign blame, let's put it this way, would you say it's that we have now a lack of competence because we simply did not train the required people, we don't have the engineers? Or would you say the people would still be there, the know-how would still be there, but we have created such a regulatory corset around building nuclear power plants that even though the technological battle has been won, it's the political, the regulatory front on which we are still losing. And by we, I mean the proponents of nuclear energy, of course.
So I'm going to talk about the U.S. experience, where we tried building 4 new reactors, and we only finished 2 of them, by the way, and the rest of the 2 bankrupted the utility who ordered them, and we abandoned them about $9 billion in. But if you look at the regulatory process that we actually had, and my father was a nuclear engineer who built the first generation of nuclear power plants in the United States, the regulatory process has actually improved dramatically compared to what it was in the 1970s and 80s by standardizing the designs, by freezing the regulatory infrastructure with a one-step licensing process. We're in a very different regulatory environment than we were post 3 Mile Island in the United States when the bulk of our fleet was being built. Despite that, we obviously did not have the most successful, and that's being charitable, about that build. So I do think it is a lot of losing competence of the industry itself, of the engineering firms, and of the nuclear reactor designers. Supply chain issues were the predominant arguable factor that delayed the projects in Georgia and South Carolina. These were modular nuclear power plants, and when you have close to a third of the modules being late by a minimum of 6 months and a median of 18 months, the critical path schedule for your project is almost impossible to meet. And when we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar project, more than that, $20 billion, $30 billion it ended up being, the interest rate alone, as you're delaying your project, becomes a substantial driver of the overall construction cost of the project. And this has even become, unfortunately, a more profound challenge given the macroeconomic conditions we find ourselves in today, with interest rates and inflation at historic highs. So I think this begs the question that our industry, first and foremost, does need to respond with utter competence. And I think we have seen that, to give your example, here in the United Arab Emirates with the building of Baraka with their partners in Korea Hydro Nuclear Power.
All right, Sunniva, you want to add something?
Yeah, I just remembered a story because we're saying that it is so expensive. And for example, let's look at the Olkiluoto 3. I mean, yes, it did take a lot longer than it should, and it cost a lot more than it should. But let's compare that to what it actually costs to build a complete energy system with 100% renewables. Because in Norway, we looked at what would it cost to build 40 terawatt hours in Norway with wind, solar, hydro, and all the system that we need to actually get then the energy security. And you get a number in Norwegian kroner, 420 billion Norwegian kroner. And let's look at, so that would give us 40 terawatt hours renewables in Norway. But what if we instead build the Olkiluoto 3 and we didn't learn anything? We did it as bad every time we did it, and we went all over, and it cost the same every time we build it. We could build 3 Olkiluoto 3 and do all the mistakes, and that would also give us 40 terawatt hours of electricity. That is, but then you have the electricity when you want it. It's stable. And it would cost 375 billion, so less than what it costs to build renewables. And this is then thinking that we don't learn anything. We do is as bad every time. And then you would also get all the extra heat, of course.
So, all right. Do you want to add something to this?
Yes, of course, I do want to add. The issue of cost for me is always debatable. If you look at what happened in COP26 in Glasgow, the developed nations gave South Africa, my country, a pledge of $8.5 billion to transition away from fossil fuels and implement renewables. And they are very specific as to which renewables to implement, and it's solar, wind, and batteries. And now you think, what would happen if they are not prescriptive in terms of what energy sources we can implement as a country? And then immediately after that pledge was given to South Africa, the country went and developed what they call the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan. And the budget for that plan is about, 1.5 to 1.9 trillion rand. And it means that the government must give guarantee to all the independent power producers so that they can be able to get those funds. So it's debatable in such that if it was not prescriptive and include all energy sources, then we would be able to achieve what we want in terms of energy mix.
Yeah. I think that the idea of getting cost-effective nuclear energy, that is a reality already many places in the world. So it's not a hypothesis. We know, like if you look to South Korea, they have always had positive learning when it comes to nuclear. They've always learned, they've never failed. They always get it cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And this is like gravity. If you start learning how to do things well, it will be cheap. And I think the key benefit of nuclear energy is that it's has a very low material intensity. That means that most of the cost to build it is labor intensive, so there's a huge amount of learning. So I think the main problem for politicians and governments and so on is that they aren't able yet to understand how you can do nuclear well, as they did here in United Arab Emirates in Baraka. They understood that they need to choose a mature technology, proven technology, instead of a first of a kind project. and they need to have a multi-unit project so that they can get scaling effects from this build out to reduce risks and maybe get better financing. So there's a lot of ways to really understand it instead of trying to not understand it.
All right, James?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think the central challenging from a finance or investment perspective is, well, if you assume that the first-of-a-kind reactor is going to be a way, have cost overruns, difficulties, the right thing from a technical policy perspective is to just do it again. Institutionalize those learnings, have lessons learned, and make sure that the next project, obviously, does not suffer from those same attitudes. The problem is investors often, with understandable reluctance, say they went through a first-of-a-kind project, and that first-of-a-kind project was a mess, let's say, and maybe even there was a very high probability that the bondholders who are financing that plant may have come close to even defaulting on that, and then no one wants to touch that technology again. And the industry itself moves on to a new technology. And I fear that in my country, in the United States, we're having this exact problem right now, where we had a pretty rough build of the first, new technology of this AP1000 from Westinghouse. We have a bunch of licensed sites, and then no one wants to touch them now because the first-of-a-kind plants were really, really difficult, and in fact bankrupted the company, one of the companies that ordered them. And so this goes back to, I think, the central theme of this panel. If we're thinking long-term thinking in nuclear investment, I think we need to recognize the unique aspects of nuclear energy as a capital-intensive, technologically complex asset type that is going to require a longer-term thinking in not just thinking about one or two plants, but a fleet-wide deployment, and how do we finance that?
Yeah, and also it's important to mention that even if you have a project that has cost overruns, just like the Olkiluoto in Finland and so on, for most technologies that are short-term, it's the next project that will be cost effective. But for nuclear, even the worst catastrophe project, when that is paid off the capital, it will give you super cheap baseload energy. And the world really, really needs that, because think about it, it's 1/3 of the electricity today is coming from coal. That's the most cost-effective baseload power source, except nuclear. Nuclear is the most cost-effective baseload energy source. So it means that if we're going to decarbonize how the energy system works today, we need to get at least 1/3 of the electricity from nuclear. That's like a 10-fold increase to even get close to net zero. So that's a huge challenge we need to face to even get close to net zero.
Now let me ask, because we mentioned also kind of the situation in South Africa, and we just heard that, for example, in Korea, right, that they never unlearned building nuclear. I think the Chinese claim that they can build a nuclear power plant in 10 years at about a quarter of the cost compared to the United States. So my question to you is, if we say, okay, that Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa and other developing countries want to go the nuclear route, who should be their partners? Like, should they look to the United States, should they look to Europe, or should they actually look to Asia, or should they look to China? Who would be their preferred partners? Or who could be their preferred partners?
I think there's no preferred partners. The African countries should go with what make economic sense to them. Whoever comes and bid, because we open the bid for different countries to come and actually pitch. So whatever pitch that makes economic sense, then the African countries should go with it, regardless of whether east or west or south. For me, whatever that makes sense economically, then Africans should go for it.
Sunniva, or James, basically to both of you a little bit. So when we look at this, and then we look at energy infrastructure and the importance it plays in our daily lives, if we say that energy is everything, that energy is life, should we rely on private investors, or should we actually say, given the initial high capital expenditures, this should be government and state expenditure? That the government says, we jump in, we take over, like use tax money or however they finance it, because this is so crucial for our infrastructure that it just needs to be there, that everything else in the economy derives from the ability and the availability of having reliable and affordable energy. So this is a core offering, a core service the government should provide. Or should we say, no, if the government does it, it's going to take too long, and they're going to use the wrong model, and it's going to be too expensive, let the private sector do it. What approach would you prefer?
Well, personally, I absolutely think that, as a Norwegian, I think that the government should have done this, and I have waited and waited for the Norwegian government to do this, but they didn't. So then finally, a year ago, I was part of founding a company, Norwegian Nuclear, that is doing this privately. And of course, I mean, to try to establish nuclear in a country where this is new, it's big chances that we will fail. I know that, but if we don't try, at least it will never happen. And we have investors that are doing this because, yeah, of course, you can do something good, but they see this as a business opportunity. And in a perfect world, in my opinion, I think that the government should have done it, but they are not doing it. And then, well, okay, then we do it with private money.
So I think, we have seen a lot of government involvement, even when we're talking about Olkiluoto 3, right? In that case, what happened was essentially that was essentially a fixed price contract to the Finnish utility TVO, and the ultimate, counterparty to that contract, which was Framatome and Arriva at the time, a company no longer exists, they defaulted essentially, and they needed to be bailed out by the French government. And so it was a wonderful gift, I think, from Paris to the Finns, that we finished Olkiluoto at a very inexpensive price, relatively speaking, to the amount of power it generates, but it was ultimately the French taxpayer who enabled that to be possible. And even in the United States, we see that most of the bonds, for example, for the plants in Georgia that were actually finished, were guaranteed by the United States government. And I think that does offer a clue that U.S. government or federal government or government backing is very, very important in a variety of ways, particularly right now where interest rates are very, very high, whereas sovereign debt is generally relatively the lowest, especially if you're a high credit-worthy country. You can finance things and get access to capital at a very, very low rate. I think there does need to be much more attention paid to policy solutions to enable capital mobilization at a low cost of capital that not only allows, obviously, the financing costs to be minimal, but also ensures that the plant will, one, be finished, and that we get a second wave of new nuclear builds constructed to actually capitalize on those lessons learned. Unfortunately, a lot of the history of this industry has been us having a build-out, it not going so well, and us trying to flip the technology, think we're going to engineer away those challenges that we had in the first deployment. And I don't think that's a sustainable model anymore.
You want to add something to this?
Yeah, so I think that in Norway, this is a very good example of the hydropower build-outs. Because all of the economists 50 years ago, they said, this will not be profitable, they said. And that's the same economists today saying that hydropower, which is a capital-intensive investment, is the most profitable energy source that we have in Norway. So it's because we didn't listen to them 50 years ago. That's the reason why we are in this good position right now. And that's the thing about the discount rate. Because with high discount rate, we are discounting the value of future generations. So if you have, let's say, a 7% discount rate, it means that any cheap electricity you produce from year 20 to year 100 has basically no value. And if we would have seen it as a critical infrastructure project to actually achieve net zero and giving a low interest rate, going from 7% to 3%, you get under half the cost of electricity. It's a ridiculous change. And also, if we also include the utilization of energy in addition to electricity, only 33% of the energy goes to electricity. If we can utilize more, let's say we could utilize up to 80%, which is the very optimistic goal of the International Atomic Energy Agency, we could actually reduce the cost 3 times. So you could 6 times, both with rent and with utilization, you could reduce it 6 times. But then nuclear would be the most cheap electricity source ever.
So you're basically saying don't trust the experts with the exception of us here on the panel. That's the idea. Now let me add another question, because I think one of the key arguments that is often being made for nuclear is its safety record, right? That it has a very, very high safety record. We also know that the issue of nuclear waste is one that can be dealt with. But let's assume that we have the tripling, the quadrupling, maybe a tenfold expansion of nuclear power, of nuclear energy. I mean, wouldn't that also, by default, increase the likelihood of accidents? It doesn't have to be, a massive world-destroying accident, but the more you have of something, the more it's like solar panels, right? If the more solar panels you have, the more often it happens that people fall off the roof and break their neck when they install solar panels. And if you have more nuclear power plants, the assumption is the likelihood of accidents happening simply goes up accordingly. Now, do you think that even for long-term investors, that they are of course very sensitive to the public opinion, because as we see, for example, in Austria and Germany, governments tend to, like a flag in the wind, kind of turn with public opinion. Nowadays we ride on a high, right? Public opinion towards nuclear energy is very high, but many remember that just 5 years ago it was very low. So if you want to make a long-term investment, can you really rely on the public and governments that are sensitive to what the public thinks, that new sentiment will maintain? What happens if you have one accident, one Fukushima again, or one Chernobyl-like thing, and once again public sentiment says, oh, we made it, or as Jonas said, right, you had the good example. They said 50 years ago, they said don't do hydro, and now everybody's happy. What if in 20 years they say, they said do nuclear, and now everybody's unhappy? How can we avoid that from happening?
That's a very difficult question, because
that's why I have you on the panel.
Yeah, well, and of course, then from the Norwegian perspective, and that I'm working a lot with, is really trying to change the public opinion on nuclear. And so far, we're on a very good direction. So in Norway now, more than 50% are saying yes to nuclear, and less than 25% are saying no. So we still need more people to say yes, but it's moving in the direction that I want it to move all the time. But I'm very aware that if something were to happen, for example, in Ukraine, of course, that will be horrible in Ukraine, but that would also be, I don't think that will be possible for us to recover from, even though, yeah, so public opinion is public opinion, and as long as we live in democracies, I mean, that's sort of, I'm not going to say it's the flaw of a democracy, but of course, I mean, the politicians are the people, and they are chosen, and if the people don't want, for example, nuclear power, then they won't have nuclear power. And that is a very boring answer that I give people when they ask me, okay, but if all you say about nuclear energy is true, then why did Germany do as they did? And the very boring answer is that Germany is a democracy where the people didn't want nuclear energy, and of course then they shouldn't have nuclear energy. That's a very simple and boring answer. And then you can ask, but why didn't they want it? But that's a different one. So yeah, public opinion. So yeah, that's when you get an accident, that does something to the public opinion. So I'm not really sure what a good answer is. Of course, I don't think that, I mean, you won't have a Chernobyl again. That is, you won't have that. And then you want to say something about that, but yeah, okay.
Yeah, don't jinx it, please.
You won't have that, because of course Chernobyl was a very special reactor with a lot of flaws, and you don't build reactors with that kind of flaws. And you can say then you had a Fukushima, and even though no one died from actually the radiation from the Fukushima accident, but you had of course all other kinds of problems. A lot of people still believe that the Fukushima accident was one of the really big parts that people were dying in the natural disaster in Japan in 2011. So I think that we still have to work on educate the people, but I think it's a hard question.
But isn't that just as a quick add-on to this, because isn't that one of the more fascinating things about the nuclear question in general? If a dam breaks in China and it kills between 26 and 50,000 people, nobody in Germany would say, we have to dismantle all our hydropower, we have to dismantle all our dams because look what happened in China. But if you have a tsunami in the Pacific, right, and something happens in Japan, you have Germany saying we have to end our nuclear power because a tsunami might strike in Bavaria any moment now.
I use that dam example all the time when I speak in Norway because, well, yeah, 50% of all of our energy comes from hydropower, and we have a lot of dams. And I know that there is a secret list of 203 dams in Norway where, well, lives will get lost if something were to happen to these dams. And but I think that, yeah, we don't think about that. And I was like, but that's okay, because we understand it in a way. We understand how it works. We think we understand the risk. And I also talk about that when people ask about what about terror towards nuclear power plants. And of course I want to say something about nuclear power plants, but I also say, honestly, if I were a terrorist, it would be much easier to do something about those dams than doing anything to a nuclear power plant. That would be very, very easy, and that would have huge consequences. I also mentioned what happened in Ukraine with the dam there, also that attacking the energy system and breaking dams, you're both destroying energy system and you are killing people, that is so much easier. I think it helps, but I also think that we are emotional human beings, and I don't think you can change that.
All right.
Thank you. I think the issue of public perception, it has to do with being transparent. I don't know of any industry or any technology in the energy industry that is as transparent as the nuclear industry. We know how many accidents we've had. We know how many people have died through radiation exposure. We also know where we keep our waste. So I think the only way to influence public perception is when we tell real stories and we talk about what is happening where in the world, and not really hide anything. Yes. And for me, when we speak about nuclear, the advanced technologies, technology reactors, we need to also mention that those advanced reactor technologies, they come with advanced safety features, and that's the only way we can convince public that we are an industry that cares.
Yeah, so I also think that we should try to prepare a little bit that accidents can come, and that we need to already now start speaking about that. It's actually a logical fallacy, the zero risk bias logical fallacy. There are people believe that if you say no to nuclear energy, there is no risk. If you say yes to nuclear energy, there is risk. But infallible technologies do not exist. According to the EU Science Panel, nuclear energy has the lowest risk of all energy sources. The biggest accident that is to say no to nuclear energy. Think about Germany now. The industry is dying out. They could restart the reactors in 1 to 3 years, 80 terawatt hours. That's 2,000 to 3,000 lives of baseload brown coal production. It's a big accident. So we need to talk about the real accident. The real accident is to say no to nuclear energy. The real accident is not to say yes, even though minor things can happen in the future.
So you're basically saying nuclear is like asking someone out on a date. It's either no risk or the ultimate risk, but there's nothing in between.
So I think all of us probably agree and understand the zero risk fallacy here of us. You know, what we did obviously in response to Fukushima killed far, far more people in both Japan and Germany and probably around the world than Fukushima, even by the most conservative models, said. But obviously investors do not feel that way. And it's not just in the nuclear power plants that we saw this, it's in the nuclear fuel cycle in particular that this really was actually quite catastrophic what occurred. Because we had so many, at that point, in the US alone, we had 3 new enrichment facilities, uranium enrichment facilities that are necessary to enrich uranium for most of the nuclear power fleet that were going to be built at that time. And the expectation that investors had that nuclear power was going to decline over the long term meant that the capital necessary to build those nuclear enrichment facilities, uranium enrichment facilities, was not mobilized. And as a result, right now, we find ourselves in the United States and in the European Union highly dependent on Russia, on the Russian Federation, for enrichment services. And this is obviously from a geostrategic, point of view, not very good. So I think we all can understand on this panel the statistical information that we know about how safe nuclear energy is, especially compared to the fossil fuel equivalents that's often replaced with. But we have yet to be able to translate that reality towards investors. And when we're thinking about long-term thinking in nuclear investment, that is sort of the name of the game. How are we going to not just convince ourselves as advocates or as industry or even as utility men or utility people, excuse me for using a gendered term, how do we convince financiers that they need to mobilize the capital in the long term, even in the event of an accident? And what is the government policy and international policy we need to implement to make that a reality?
All right. Well, I would be amiss given the large crowd that has gathered here if I wouldn't at least have some questions from the audience, and I think this is a good starting point. Yes, please.
The way I see it, we're hanging by our fingernails with climate change. The way I see it, we're hanging by our fingernails by climate change. We're going to blow right through 1.5 degrees. I mean, 2023 is going to be the hottest on record. And so if we take a purist thing, I mean, if somebody wants to build a nuclear power plant, and that's a contribution. If you want to do a solar plant or hydro, people don't even like hydro. Where I come from, in Kansas, people don't even like utility solar. They want an only rooftop solar. We can't afford to be purist. You're right, we're human beings, and we all have fears and biases. But we need everything to make this even come close. If you don't like, if you didn't like 1.5 degrees, where do you see 2? Where do you see 2.5? Someone wants to build a nuclear plant, that's a positive.
Yeah. All right. Anybody else?
Okay, Jonas, you made a very good point that as we have more nuclear power generation systems, the likelihood of something might go wrong will naturally increase, right? But the important point they've mentioned was we can prepare the public, right? How do we prepare the public in the most efficient way so that if something goes wrong, there's not a mass hysteria that we have seen in the past? Like, is there any thoughts or insights on in terms of education or being transparent that we could do to make it aware more broadly?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think what I said about this zero risk bias, I see even professors at my department at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, even them aren't understanding their logical fallacy of zero risk bias. So they talk to to people who work on nuclear energy as if the only way they could accept nuclear energy is an infallible technology. So they make like a impossible target for nuclear people, and they have no standard for themselves. Like we shouldn't accept that, I think, and we should maybe talk more about the statistics and what actually no to nuclear have a cost worldwide. We're look at Europe now. It was 1/3 of the world economy, and now it's 1/6. And if we don't have Europe is deindustrializing fast speed. If Europe don't focus on actually the power sources that are needed to keep up their economical standards, Europe will be in ruin. So we need to talk about that as well. That having non-cost effective firm, no firm power sources, it has been catastrophic to Europe. And if that's also a risk that we don't focus on the energy mix that the other parts of the world are focusing on.
Just one thing I want to say about preparing the public, because I think that what you said about being transparent is so extremely important, because we build trust with the public now when things are going okay. We don't do it when the accident happened. We have to build trust all the time. Build trust, build trust.
I'm sorry if somebody's asked this question before, but you hear a lot about these micro plants, smaller facilities which are cheaper, quicker to build, and if something does go wrong, they're more containable. Have we discussed this at all? Is this something that is in the future of nuclear industry? So that's a question, and I just want to point out something. I saw a BBC ran a expose 2 days ago. I saw it in my hotel room, and they were talking about the concentration of particles in the air here in the UAE because of flaring, and how it's having a direct impact on the health of the locals, with lung cancer, asthma in children. It's killing people. You don't hear anything about it. So, and you know, that's just the comment. So I don't know if that's part of educating people towards other energies, but it's just going right over.
So,
Thank you.
I think when you say cheaper for microreactors or even small modular reactors, although it gets, what does cheaper mean? So obviously if you're making less, if the capacity of the plant is smaller, you're going to hopefully pay a lot less for it, but you're also going to get a lot less power out of it. So the question that we need to be asking is how much power, what is the price per unit power or per unit energy, depending on how we want to calculate this. And it's not clear at this point, maybe it will be, maybe it won't be, that the smaller reactors are necessarily going to be more affordable. There's very good reasons to think they might be actually more expensive per unit energy. And the question that we have ultimately that's going to be proven out in the next decade or two is whether in fact the classical economies of scale that caused the nuclear industries from the 1950s, 60s and 70s to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and therefore thinking, hoping, and maybe it didn't work always, but it generally did work, to get cheaper and cheaper per unit megawatt or unit megawatt hour, if that can work the opposite direction. And there's a lot of reasons to think it may actually get cheaper. Maybe you can factory fabricate better. The financing is certainly going to be much, much easier to build a 10 megawatt plant than a 1,000 megawatt plant, even if the 1,000 megawatt plant is much more expensive, cheaper per unit megawatt hour than the 10 megawatt plant. So we're in this interesting place right now, I think, in the nuclear industry, where we're asking the question, and we're about to try, I think, to see if we can go smaller and be more economical. But I think what is true right now, absent policy change, smaller is more financeable. It does not make it mean it's cheaper, however. That's the question.
May I give the last word to you?
Yes, thank you so much. I'm just going to touch a little bit on the issue of the small modular reactors and micro reactors. I have been advocating for coal to nuclear a lot. As you know, in South Africa, we are mostly powered by coal, and there are coal power plants that are aging. And we have witnessed a coal power plant being shut down and repurposed with renewables. The coal plant was giving us about 1,000 megawatt, and those renewables, which is wind, solar, and batteries, they are only giving us 350 megawatt. So for me, I advocate for small modular reactors to be repurposing those coal power plants, and we look into issues of leveraging the current infrastructure that we can use for nuclear, and also the workforce development, issues of reskilling and retraining of the current workforce, so that we retain the number of people who work in the plant, in the coal plant, so that they continue working in the nuclear plant. But now, in closing, I'd like to take you back to the current theme of this session, which is securing our energy future, long-term thinking and nuclear investment. I want to take you back to first and second, industrial development. Imagine if we had leaders who did not have vision, who did not think long-term. Would we be gathered here at COP today talking about issues of energy? Because we would not even have energy altogether. So I want the current leaders to also think visionary, to think long-term, so that, and gather all the stakeholders in the energy sector to come together and solve this long-term problem, which is net zero 2050. Thank you so much.
Thank you.